Hello, everybody. I just wanted to go live to share my sermon today, since we do not have a live stream. And so this sermon is titled, The Upside Down Kingdom. The Upside Down Kingdom. And in this, we are going to be looking at Matthew 5, 1 to 13. And so I'm going to read Matthew 5, 1 to 13. Matthew 5, 1 to 13 says, Now when he saw the crowds, he went up on a mountainside and sat down. His disciples came to him, and he began to teach them, saying, Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called sons of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven. For in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. About that. So as we open up this passage, it tells us that Jesus saw the crowds and went up on a mountainside and began to teach. As we look at this setting, it is important that we understand where the crowds were coming from and what Jesus was trying to do here. The passage before us tells us that Jesus was going throughout Galilee, teaching in different synagogues and healing every disease and sickness among people. And because of this, there was interest growing in who Jesus was, and many people were bringing to him those that were sick to be healed. As Jesus continued to heal people, there were large crowds that began to approach Jesus and follow him. Now, many people believe that Jesus going up on the mountainside was him trying to get away from the disciples, was him trying to get away from the people that were trying to follow him. But I don't think that's what was going on here. I don't think that Jesus was trying to get away from those that were following him, but I do think that he wanted to make it abundantly clear who he was and what he was about. Because I think there may have been many people who are following Jesus because of his power. There may have been a longing for the Messiah. In fact, the Bible says that there was a longing for the Messiah, that the Jewish people were longing for the Messiah. That's what we talked about a couple weeks ago on Palm Sunday. These people were longing for the Messiah to come and restore the Jewish kingdom, to restore the Jewish people to power. And they may have been thinking that Jesus had come to be this kind of Messiah. They may have thought that Jesus was coming to restore the Jewish kingdom. And yet in this, Jesus begins to teach his disciples who he really is and who he really is not. Jesus begins to teach them that his kingdom is a completely different kind of kingdom, a completely upside down kingdom. And in this, Jesus makes it clear to his disciples what his kingdom is really about. As Jesus opens up his Sermon on the Mount, he seems to be concerned with who the disciples are before he is concerned about what they will do. He is more concerned about who they will be as people. He is more concerned about who they will be as disciples. And in fact, in this first statement, in this first part of his sermon, he introduces 8 different characteristics that these disciples are supposed to have, or that they are supposed to obtain. And these are characteristics that reflect the transformation that the disciples are to have when they come to Jesus, but they're also characteristics that we are to have when we come to Jesus. These are characteristics that we are supposed to reflect as God transforms our lives and as we live in his kingdom. Each of these characteristics begins with the word blessed. Now, this word blessed is interesting because when we think of blessed, We think of when someone gets a nice house, they may say that they have been blessed. When someone gets a nice car, they may say that they have been blessed. But as we read this, it does not talk about material possessions. It doesn't even talk about a good life from the outside looking in. But it does talk about being connected to Jesus and the transformation that happens when you are connected to Jesus. And so this first characteristic that is expressed is poor in spirit. Now, in some translations, this term poor in spirit is reduced to just poor. And people say, blessed are you if you are poor. But it's not talking about material wealth here. Many historians claim that the term poor in spirit more accurately fits here. The question then becomes, what does poor in spirit mean? I believe it speaks to the spiritual state that you are in before you come to God. It speaks to the reality that without God, we are dead in our sin. We are helpless, we are hopeless, and we have nothing to bring to God. And yet God invites us to come to him in our humble state. God invites us to come to him, although we can bring him nothing, and to lay ourselves down at his feet. This is the starting place of the spiritual journey, to recognize that without God, we have nothing, but that God wants us anyway. And because God wants us anyway, he became the way for us to approach him and to draw into his presence. And we are promised the kingdom of heaven. But as we talked about in the I Am series, although we are promised heaven after death, if we are followers of Jesus, the kingdom of heaven is a bigger reality than that. The kingdom of heaven, in that context, is related to the idea that heaven invaded earth, and that now we can experience a foretaste of heaven in relationship with God, right here and right now. That is the starting place for our relationship with God. We acknowledge our spiritually poor state, and we come to the feet of Jesus, and he invites us into relationship with him. From this reality, from the reality that we are poor in spirit, each of these other characteristics come into play. The second characteristic is those that mourn are comforted. Now, this too does not mean what people often think it means. When I read this verse previously, up until this week, I thought about mourning as in mourning the loss of a loved one. But as I researched and looked into this passage this week, this word mourn most likely means something more specific. This word mourn more closely speaks about mourning the reality of what sin has done to our personal lives and what sin has done to the world. As we look at our personal lives, and as we look at the world, we recognize that it is not what God intended it to look like. When we look at the Garden of Eden and the connection that the first humans had with God and the world in which they lived, it seems like we are far off from that world. And this causes us to mourn as Christians, as we long for a world that we as humanity once had. And we are called to think and reflect on the sad state of the world that we live in. Because of this, we mourn. And yet, even in our mourning, we are promised that we will be comforted. We are comforted because we know that there will be a day when Christ returns and makes all things new. We are comforted as we mourn our personal spiritual state because we know that we will one day live in the fullness of relationship with God. We are comforted as we mourn the world's spiritual state because we are promised that God will one day return and make all that is wrong in the world right. And this, as Christians, should cause us to experience great comfort. We should be comforted by the reality that God is still committed to us, and that because he is faithful, though we suffer now, there will be a day when all things are made right again. The third characteristic speaks about the word meekness. This is again a characteristic that can be very misunderstood. Many people read the word meekness and they think of weakness. But this is actually not true. The term meekness actually means, and it comes from the idea of strength under control. In that context, the word meekness was used for a soldier who had a sword and the ability to dominate with their sword, but chose not to. This again is another picture of humility, as we choose to recognize and understand ourselves in the light of the grace of God. Although Jesus had unlimited strength and power as God, he chose to enter into the world as a human and become a servant. Jesus chose not to exert his dominance over others, but instead to see others as more important than himself and serve them. And this is the life that we are called to as kingdom dwellers. Even though we may have worldly strength or worldly status in our jobs, in our families, in our neighborhoods, we are called not to use that worldly status and strength to dominate others. Instead, we are called to be meek and to elevate others above ourselves in a commitment to serve them. In this, we will inherit the earth. We may not inherit the earth as we would if we choose to exert our dominance. We will not inherit status from the earth, or we will not inherit material wealth from the earth, but we will inherit the things of the earth that truly matter. Things like purpose, fulfillment, satisfaction. We will inherit the earth because we are meek. The fourth characteristic is those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. Now, this characteristic is not talking about desiring to follow every rule and be righteous just for righteousness' sake. This characteristic is not talking about doing right things because we are trying to earn God's love. I think sometimes as Christians, we get so caught up trying to do good things because we think that we can earn God's love by doing these good things. And so we try to be perfect and we try to make the right decisions so that maybe God will love us. But this is not what is being talked about here. I believe we come to Christ with our fully flawed human selves. And as we come to him with our fully flawed human selves, we will begin to hunger and thirst for righteousness. As we understand God's love for us, I believe we will desire to make decisions that love him in return. As we begin to understand the depth of God's love, I believe that we will begin to hunger and thirst to do right by him. But the beginning is not trying to do good things. The beginning is not trying to do right things just to measure up to a standard. The beginning is understanding God's love for you and living out of that love for you. The fifth characteristic is blessed are the merciful. And this characteristic goes back to the idea of being poor in spirit. Because when we are poor in spirit, when we recognize that we are flawed and that we have sinned, it should affect how we see other people's sins. When we recognize that we are flawed and that we are only saved because of God's grace, that should change how we view the unsaved. I think in our current culture, we have a problem as American Christians with the way we see the unsaved. I think we get saved as Christians, and then we forget where we were saved from, and because of this, we look down on the unsaved. We point fingers at them and think that they are horrible people, and that we are so much better than them. We say things like, look at the drunks, look at the druggies. Can you believe them? In this, we are forgetting that before Christ, we were messed up, and it is only because of the grace of God that we are made new. It is only because of the cross of Christ that we have been saved, not because of anything that we have done or will do. And because of that, I think it is how we should see those that are unsaved and those that are living far from Christ. We are to see them in the way that God sees them, as sinners, worthy of love, worthy of his grace, worthy of his mercy. See, because Jesus sees them as worthy of his grace. Jesus sees them as worthy of his mercy. The sixth characteristic is those who are pure in heart will see God. As we think about pure in heart, this idea reflects the reality that our hearts are transformed by God as we come to him. As our hearts are transformed, I believe that we begin to desire the wills and ways of God. I believe that our hearts begin to commit deeper and more fully to what God has for us. The idea here of being pure in heart speaks to undivided loyalty and singleness of devotion. It is understanding that we are devoted to God and not splitting our allegiances between two things. I think of the statement that Jesus makes about money and God later in this sermon. In Matthew 6:24, Jesus says, "No one can serve two masters. Either you will hate the one and love the other, or you will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money." In this particular verse, Jesus is talking about God and money, but I think it is relevant to a more deeper and more convicting reality. I believe the idea is that we cannot love both God and the world. We cannot serve both God and the world. With our hearts first and then our lives, we must choose whether we will follow the world's ways or whether we will follow God's ways. And as Christians, this is a daily decision that we must make. It is a minute-by-minute decision we must make. Yes, we must make it when we choose to follow Jesus. But I think every day we decide whether we will love God or whether we will love the world. When we choose whether or not we will join the gossip at work, we are choosing whether we will love God or the world. When we choose whether or not we will forgive the person that has wronged us, we are choosing whether or not we will love God or the world. When we choose whether or not we will serve that person in front of us who is hurting, we are choosing whether or not we will love God or the world. Every day, every minute, we are given decisions whether we will love God or love the world. But Jesus says it is with a pure heart we will see God. Because when we choose to have an undivided sole allegiance to Jesus and his way, we will be able to see God more fully. When we focus on Jesus, we will be able to see God more fully for who he is. Because we won't have those things blocking us. The seventh characteristic of the kingdom dweller is that they are a peacemaker. As I think about what it means to be a peacemaker, I think this characteristic stands in stark contrast to the ways of the world. In this current moment that we are in our world, we are more divided than ever. You can call our country the divided states of America, not the United States of America. There's great division in our country, but I think we see it everywhere. When we log onto our social media accounts and we see the posts people make and the comments that ensue, we see the division of the world. However, as followers of Jesus, living in a different kind of kingdom, this verse reminds us that we have a different calling in the midst of conflict. As followers of Jesus, our calling in the midst of conflict is to be peacemakers. We are called to make peace between conflicting parties. Why? So that people may experience the unity and harmony that God designed them to. Now, this doesn't mean that we are called to be peacekeepers. There's a great difference between peacekeepers and peacemakers. I think oftentimes we get so caught up in peacemaking. And so we'll walk on eggshells around people, and we won't take time to address conflict, and we'll kind of be quiet, and we'll say, "Hello, how's it going?" But we just let the tension, let the anger fester and grow in our hearts. but we never address it. And we never approach the person that we are in conflict with because we think that we have peace with them. But we don't have peace with them. We just have niceties with them. Jesus calls us to make peace, even when it is difficult to make peace. As we think about making peace, I think it relates to two other characteristics. I think it relates to being poor in spirit and being merciful. Because with being poor in spirit, we are able to acknowledge our wrongs and our flaws as humans. When we humbly come into addressing conflict and making peace, it is vitally important that we acknowledge our own wrongdoing. Often in conflict, we come with fingers pointed at the other person, but this is the wrong attitude to have. We must first look at our wrongs and seek to make our wrongs right before we point out others' wrongs. In addition, I think this relates to being merciful, because when we show mercy to people, we are able to look past their wrongs. We are able to quickly forgive their wrongs when we understand and empathize with people's shortcomings. When we are poor in spirit, we acknowledge our own wrongdoings. But when we are merciful, we are able to look past others' wrongdoings. The eighth and last characteristic is blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness. This talks about the reality that as followers of Jesus, there may be persecution faced. As Jesus talks to his disciples, he undoubtedly knew that the disciples would face persecution. Many of them had harsh things said to them, faced physical punishment, and were even killed for their faith. This was the cost of following Jesus for them. And Jesus knew this. As Jesus told them, blessed are the persecuted, he knew that they would be persecuted, and he still called them blessed. In our current country, we experience great freedom when it comes to living out our faith and following Jesus. We are not killed or tortured for our faith. But I think the last couple verses in this passage still can speak to us. Because as Christians living in our current context, there are still moments where we may be insulted or outcasted for our faith. Many of you may work in jobs or live in families or live in communities where you feel some of this. I know that I have talked to a few Christians lately that work in secular jobs that have faced insults or been outcasted for their faith. Now, thankfully, I still believe in our country we have it very good. In some countries, people don't have it this good. But in our country, we have it very good when it comes to living out our faith. But there are still moments where living out our faith brings challenges and where we feel like we are persecuted for our faith. And yet, in the midst of this, we are promised that if we cling to Christ, if we continue to live for Christ, we will have a great reward in heaven. We are promised that though we struggle now, there will come a moment when Jesus returns and makes all things right. We are promised that no matter what life holds for us, no matter the difficulty of the kingdom in the present, the King still wins. At the end of the day, the King still wins. And so we read these characteristics. We read these Beatitudes. And some of them sound hard. It is hard to make peace sometimes. It is hard to be merciful sometimes. It's hard to be pure in heart sometimes. But the call of Christ is hard. The cost of following Jesus is great. When Jesus called the disciples, he told them, pick up your cross and follow me. In this, Jesus was saying, as you follow me, die to yourself. And that's the same call for all of us. We are called to die to ourselves. We are called to live in a difficult kingdom. But even in that, we can take great courage. We can take great joy because we know that at the end of the day, the King will return. The King will make all wrong right. The king will reign over the entire world, and the king will win. And because he has victory, we know we will have victory. And so this week, as we go from here, as we live life in this difficult kingdom, would we remember that the king has won, the king will win, and would we live into the kingdom? Peace out.